A real pleasure to be here, and congratulations to Friends of the Chicago River on some great accomplishments and being an inspiration for all of us in other cities throughout North America. What comes to mind when you think of Detroit? Give me some answers. Cars. Come on, speak up, please. What?
Urban agriculture.
Urban agriculture. I don't think I've ever gotten that question. That's awesome. That is true, though.
Pawn shops.
Pawn shops.
Vacant property.
Vacant property.
Bankruptcy.
What was that? Bankruptcy. The largest city in the United States to ever go through bankruptcy. We have a lot of tags. The largest infant mortality rate in large cities in the United States. A whole bunch of things. But, you know, certainly cars. Professional sports. Tigers lost last night. I'm really upset about that. Art. Motown. Music. I mean incredible things. I like to explain Detroit from the perspective of paradigm shifts and how Detroit has, hopefully at the end of this talk, well, you'll think that Detroit sometimes has done something fairly well in responding to paradigm shifts. You know, a significant change of thinking that results in a completely changed view or outlook. Think of what a paradigm shift did, you know, the printing press did, or the personal computer has done. Detroit was founded because of the fur trade. We are older than the United States. Founded in 1701. 313 years old, you know. They wiped out beaver in Europe pretty much, and they came looking for that to meet fashion demand, and we literally became an exporter of beaver in the center of it. When they moved, they had to move people and goods to settle the West. You can imagine how important Detroit became in the center of the Great Lakes, you know, and in the 1890s, more ships were built along the Detroit River than any city in the United States. Shipbuilding was huge. We met the needs of the nation and the world. It became such a busy river system that in 1819, by act of Congress, it became a public highway. Everyone knows automobiles. We're the automobile capital of the United States and Canada. Windsor, Ontario, right across the river, less than 1 mile. With the stroke of the pen, FDR converted all civilian productivity in Detroit to military productivity with one single purpose: to win the war. Amazing. We went on to become the arsenal of democracy, and an incredible story. Each of these paradigm shifts had some unintended consequences. The fur trade literally wiped out beaver east of the Mississippi River. The arsenal of democracy time, you can imagine there were no pollution controls, and it just resulted in substantial oil pollution. Towards the end of the war, 1946 to 48, they estimated how much oil and petroleum products were going into the Detroit River. 5.9 million gallons of oil and petroleum products. It takes 1 gallon of oil to pollute 1 million gallons of water of the Chicago River or Lake Michigan. There were 6 million. That means there's enough oil going into the Detroit River to pollute the entire western basin of Lake Erie. All Michigan waters, all Ohio waters, all Ontario waters. That's how much. It was a cold winter, just like this last winter. And there were, as the upper Great Lakes started freezing over Lake Michigan, the waterfowl started moving, looking for food, started migrating. They come down where the intersection of two flyways. They landed in the small few pockets of open water left on the Detroit River. What was in the open water? Oil. 11,000 ducks and geese died in one weekend. A group of duck hunters from the lower Detroit River picked up the oil-soaked carcasses of ducks and geese, threw them into their trucks, drove to Lansing, Michigan, the upper right-hand corner, threw them on the steps leading to the state capitol, threw them on the front porch. They walked up, they called a press conference, just like Friends of the Chicago River, and said, how dare you do this to the place we call home, to the place where we hunt and fish. They now, looking back, are credited with starting the Industrial Pollution Control Program in the state of Michigan, a group of people who cared about their home. Incredible story. That was Detroit River. You can imagine, we were front page headlines in all the Michigan papers. Here's another one. 1965, Time Magazine. Headline, Lake Erie is dead. One of the big sources being Detroit and Detroit River. You can imagine being on the front of it. That was very poor journalism, if there are any journalism people in the audience. It was not true. It was more alive than ever. There was so much phosphorus going in that was causing algal blooms. The algal blooms would settle out, use up the oxygen, and then the fish would die. The decomposing algae and fish would windrow on all the bathing beaches. And it took front-end loaders and dump trucks to remove them. And what is the smell of an anaerobic process? It's called hydrogen sulfide. It's rotten eggs. It was incredible. That was 1965. People started, this is downtown Detroit, Save Lake Erie. They started to speak out. This is what they were looking at during that time. These are some of the pictures of our backyard, what we call it. In 1969, there was so much oil and grease on the Rouge River, which is the heart of the Ford Rouge plant, and where Henry Ford consolidated all operations. There was so much oil and grease. A worker dropped an acetylene torch, the whole river caught on fire, and that's the fireboat, the John Kendall from Detroit. 10 pieces of fire equipment to put the river out. You had a few fires too in your time. 1970, a graduate student from University of Western Ontario came over from Scandinavia and was thinking about mercury, both natural sources of mercury and anthropogenic sources of mercury, and said, you know, we have mercury cell operations in Sarnia, Ontario, and Wyandotte, Michigan, that are making chlorine and caustic soda. The byproduct of that process is elemental mercury. Where do you think that mercury grows? We don't have a clue where it goes. It was going into our rivers, right? So he went out and sampled the fish of Lake St. Clair and came up with, on the average, hundreds of fish, 3 milligrams per kilogram parts per million, 6 times the safe standard for human consumption. Graduate student walks into governments in Canada and the United States and says, I want to take a look at these data. And he says, well, you're just a student. Go out and review the data. So he goes out and redoes it again, comes up with comparable numbers. So then the governments go out. That became the mercury crisis of 1970. It went right across the world. They had to shut the fishery, all sport and commercial fishing, from the St. Clair River to Lake St. Clair, Detroit River, and western Lake Erie. They had to shut it down entirely because of mercury. That was our backyard. Most people, when they think of Earth Day, they think of Madison, Wisconsin, and they think of California and some of the protests. Early on, one of the big things were unions. Think of unions in Detroit. And here is, on the right, is the Canadian Auto Workers, the union in a boat in the middle of the Detroit River. The boat on the left is the UAW, United Auto Workers, coming out and doing a wake on the Detroit River on the very first Earth Day, saying the river is dead and making a difference. Incredible. If you look at that, we had waterfowl die-offs of tens of thousands in 1960 and 67. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, the eutrophication of Lake Erie, the burning of the Rouge and the Cuyahoga rivers, the mercury crisis. All of that led to Earth Day, to the Canada Water Act in 1970, the Clean Water Act in 72, the Endangered Species Act, and something called the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that has a world-class reputation. All of that, amazing. It's been over 4 decades. What has happened? It's pretty cool. We've seen substantial reductions in oil and grease, and we've eliminated winter duck kills due to oil pollution. We have spent billions of dollars on achieving secondary treatment with phosphorus removal. We've seen a 90% decline in phosphorus concentrations in loadings of the river. We've seen since 1960, there's been an 80% reduction in untreated volume of combined sewer overflow waste from communities in southeast Michigan. Pretty neat. Between the 60s and 80s, there was a 4,000 metric ton per day decrease in chloride loadings from chemical industries. We've seen now a 70% decline in the mercury contamination of fishes as a result of the mercury crisis. A 90% decline in DDT contamination of the fish. We've seen a byproduct of DDT is called DDE, a 90% decline in DDE, and an 85% decline in PCBs and herring gull eggs on islands in the Detroit River. And we've had over 1 million cubic meters of contaminated sediment remediation at a cost of $154 million in the last 15 years. That's a pretty remarkable story for the industrial heartland. But that's not the best part of the story. Here's the story of rewilding. We went 25 years with no bald eagles reproducing because of organochlorine pesticide contamination and eggshell thinning and reproductive failure of these birds. We now, 25 years, no reproduction of bald eagles. We now have 22 active nests in the watershed along the Detroit River. Amazing story. Peregrine falcons, again, 25 years of no reproductive success. Brought in hacking boxes on skyscrapers, just like downtown Chicago. We produce at least 10 young per year. We fledge them, they leave their nest, and they've actually expanded their range, and they're living on the Ambassador Bridge, the #1 border crossing between Canada and the United States. More trade goes over that bridge, and peregrine falcons living out there. First time since the 1890s, we have osprey in Wayne County. Wayne County is the Detroit county, and pretty amazing. They nested on a cell phone tower and feed in the marshes that we actually own and manage as part of the Refuge. We did everything possible to diminish lake sturgeon. We treated them as a trash fish. We built shipping channels and destroyed their spawning habitat. We destroyed their nursery habitat. We polluted their river. We just saw a tremendous decline of lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes, and in particular the Detroit River, which was the spawning and nursery grounds. We then found no reproduction was documented between the 1970s and 1999, and then in 2001 we documented they were back and reproducing and producing young. Lake whitefish are back. First time since 1916 reproducing in the Detroit River. This is all science-based work. In the 70s, our walleye population was in a crisis state, according to all the fishery managers, and now we're part of the walleye capital of the world, and we offer $500,000 tournaments each year on the Detroit River. If for you fisher anglers in the audience, that's a 14.2-pound walleye. That's a pretty amazing one. And beaver, of course, we wiped them out east of the Mississippi. They could not have lived in the Detroit River during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, 4 decades, because of oil pollution. That would map their fur. They couldn't thermoregulate. They would die. They couldn't make it. In 2008, a pair of beaver swam over from Canada up in the Lake St. Clair watershed, discovered a power plant intake channel, found a bunch of poplar trees, and started to eat the bark. The rest is history. They produced some young. We now have beaver in 6 locations in the watershed, and they're sort of like a rock star, you know. But again, you have to remember, during the 1960s, we were one of the most polluted rivers in North America. Now, we are one of the most remarkable ecological recovery stories in North America. The return of bald eagles, peregrine falcons, osprey, lake whitefish, lake sturgeon, walleye. But we have our challenges, much like Chicago. Population growth, transportation expansion, sprawl. We continue to lose and degrade habitat. We've got non-point source pollution everywhere we look. We still have the legacy of toxic substances contamination, and we're ground zero for many exotic species because we're right on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And of course, we have greenhouse gases and global warming. This is downtown Detroit 5 years ago. Okay, a lot of vacant, bombed out buildings, a lot of material storage piles where the only thing that was done down there was freighters would come in and offload limestone and 21 AA and everything else. And so it was just really, really sad. And brought up a group of people together with a vision, just like Friends of the Chicago River, and said, what if you had a choice of doing something on that waterfront, what would you do? And everyone says, oh, we've been through this 15 times. Nothing is ever going to happen. And they said, well, let's play what if, but let's do something differently. Let's go after all the people that care about the Detroit River, starting with the foundations, things like Kresge, things like Charles Stewart Mott and Hudson Weber, some of the ones that were founded in Detroit and are still in Detroit. Let's go after the corporations. Let's talk to them about attracting and retaining the next generation of employees and how important the work is. We are. And this is what's happening. This is the very same area. If you've not been to Detroit in the last 6 months, it changes every 6 months. It's an amazing story of the largest urban waterfront redevelopment project by scale in the United States. We took 5.5 miles. Think of, if you started right there at Lake Michigan and went up 5.5 miles and wiped the slate clean, brought in a group of stakeholders and said, what do you want to do? That's what happened. They raised $140 million in 8 years to catalyze this thing. It's a pretty name. It's called the Detroit Riverwalk, much like Taste of Chicago and Grant Park. There's so many cool things going on. We are behind cities, but we're going to try to catch up. Also, think about the change in perception from nothing but a working river in the industrial heartland to a polluted river in the Rust Belt. What would you like to be known for? Well, maybe an international wildlife refuge. We created a vision and went after the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, who lived in Windsor, Ontario, and Congressman John Dingell, who was still is the Dean of Congress, and said, we would like to be known for something besides pollution, industry, decline, and people leaving. And we created an international wildlife refuge. It extends from southwest Detroit, the Ohio border, goes across the river and goes as far as the archipelago between the western and central basins of Lake Erie. It's got incredible assets in it. I'm going to just give you a few stories. Think of industry in Detroit and what we did over 313 years to harden the shoreline, to put in steel sheet piling, to put in concrete breakwater, to harden it. That has no habitat value for our resources. There's no value to fish or wildlife. Could we do it just as safe, just as stable, enhance habitat, make it more aesthetically pleasing, and maybe even save some money? It's called soft shoreline engineering. What we did is go out and take some shorelines and do some demonstration projects, like a power plant. Look at that shoreline, the upper left-hand corner. Nothing but broken concrete, poured asphalt, no value whatsoever in the bottom right-hand corner. There's no breakwater that they were going to take out from 1910. We said, before you go any further, at least listen to us. Let us bring the right people to the table, and we can do it just as safe, just as stable, enhance habitat, make it more aesthetically pleasing, and save you some money. And we actually old oxbow there. We've done 53 projects in the last 14 years. Amazing part of it. We have a wetland of international importance on the Detroit River. There's 32 miles of waterfront. 31 is hardened with that concrete and steel. 1 is in its natural state. 1 mile. And they want to develop it and put housing on it, a marina, and on and on and on. And a group of citizens were able to save it. Okay? Then a piece of property right next to it was an industrial brownfield. Sat for 15 years, just with barbed wire around it. We took the challenge on of cleaning it up from industrial standards, brownfield gets cleaned up for another industry to come in, to human health and wildlife standards, way higher. It's taken us 11 years to do that, but we've done it, and there's what the rendering looks like. We're going to put a gold LEED certified visitor center there on an industrial brownfield to reconnect. It's got a kayak landing. The school ship is going to dock there, Great Lakes school ship that takes people out on the river and lake and uses it as a living laboratory. It's got greenway trails all ending up here, and right next to it is 410 acres, the only wetland of international importance in the state of Michigan, Humbug Marsh. We had something called the Black Lagoon. Can you imagine? This explains it right here. 1961, this industry, steel company, doesn't matter the name, was putting in oil. That's the Black Lagoon in the lower right-hand corner. So it's an embayment. It's a bayou on the Detroit River. So where water velocities slow out, slow down, things settle out, right? It becomes a depositional area in terms of sediment. So scientists went in there and did core sampling and looked at, the vertical profile of contamination. They found a band in the middle of it, nothing but oil and grease from where. So that became while we could still tackle that and clean that up before a big flood event came, before ice scour, before a big wind event, lifted it up, resuspended, moved it out into the Detroit River, moved it out into Lake Erie. We did something about it. It was really cool. So we removed 115,000 cubic yards, look, a double silt screed curtain in there, $9.3 million, and we enhanced habitat and we renamed it to Elias Cove. Pretty neat and amazing project. With the evidence that lake sturgeon were back in the river, we thought it would be very cool to go out and what was limiting sturgeon productivity was habitat, not environmental quality. So we felt the hypothesis was if we could build a reef of the right sizes of limestone material with the right sizes of interstitial spaces, it could work. It was the first ever fish habitat restoration project in the Great Lakes, funded with both U.S. and Canadian money. We actually sent money, I had to send it, $125,000 to Canada. You can imagine me explaining that and why I was doing that. But the very next spring, they came, they spawned. It was the first time in 30 years in this area. Amazing story. There were 16 partners to make it. We need to think outside our comfort zone. What percentage of the people in the world live in urban areas? What percentage of people living in the world live in urban areas? Take a guess.
80.
80. 54. Okay. What percent of the U.S. population lives in urban areas?
80.
Some say that 80%. 80%. So where is the next generation of conservationists, environmentalists going to come from? It's going to come from Chicago. It's going to come from Detroit. It's going to come from Portland. It's going to come from these areas. We need to do a lot more like that. If you look at ours, some of these you're already doing them, but these are, I was asked to give a couple of the lessons learned from here. We had to reach agreement on a broad-based agreement on a long-term sustainability vision founded on this sense of place. What makes Chicago, Detroit, unique and cool? We have key champions. You have a mayor. We have a John Dingell. You need a key champion who is well recognized throughout the region, trusted, and can open doors to money and to bring the right people to the table. You need core project delivery teams by project. Ensure all the regulatory agencies are at the table up front to ensure buy-in and get the permits when you need them. You want to recruit and inspire partners to get involved in all aspects of the project and expect the unexpected and keep focused on the long-term vision. Place a priority on sound science-based decision-making, ensure that, and this can result in more cost and ecosystem-effective decisions. We've actually been able to prove that. Obviously, to ensure transparency in decision-making, measure and celebrate successes. Bring Girl Scouts out, bring the school groups out, bring out Boy Scouts. Make them part of these celebrations and these stewardship projects. Quantify benefits. Put out their economic numbers. Invest in people to do the economic benefits assessment to measure what you've done, and of course, place a high priority on education and outreach to develop the next generation of conservationists and sustainability entrepreneurs. It's one of my favorite quotes from a landscape architect. There are millions of difficult challenges and delightful opportunities ahead. I think the only constraint is the willingness to dream, to create and hope and feel undefended enough to face the tough questions and ideas that must be fiercely engaged at this moment in human history. If design is the signal of human intention, again, if design is the signal of human intention, then we must continuously ask ourselves, what are our intentions for our children, for the children of all species, for all time? And how do we boldly and profitably manifest the best of these intentions? Thank you for all you do for the Chicago River in Chicago and for being a wonderful example for us and other major urban areas. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions for me?
Go ahead.
I'm curious, the brief for the lake sturgeon, what does that look like? What is it made of?
Okay. It is on, in United States terms, you know, the bottom lands of the Great Lakes are owned by the individual states. In Canada, they're owned by the federal government. They're called crown lands. Okay, so it's owned by that. What does it look like? There are 4 different types. We did it as an experiment. We involved scientists. There were 4 different treatments. Big rocks, middle ones, little ones, and a mixture of the 3, and 3 replicates each. It's extended over an entire width of the channel. It was very cool. And it worked on all 3. It worked a little bit better where the water velocities were highest. So what we did was take that knowledge and then double the size of that reef with 1 single treatment in the highest flow regions. And we just finished that this past fall. So it's basically lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, walleye are lithophilic, rock-loving, spawning fishes. So rock-loving. So they want the rocks that will form little spaces, interstitial spaces between the rocks, and are able to. And then they need nursery habitat in close proximity. So once the eggs and the larvae come off the reef, they're going to float. They have to find some place to rest, to hide out and not get eaten by something bigger, and to feed a little so they can continue their journey down to Lake Erie. Yes, sir?
What are these for nursery habitat?
Nursery habitat. So we've got some wetland habitat, some coastal wetland habitat on the Detroit River, on the Canadian side, and some island habitat where we're enhancing habitat specifically so that they can rest a little and feed. Yes?
How are you addressing nutrient pollution?
You can imagine, obviously the whole emphasis in the United States and Canada was first on picking on the biggest sources. Those were wastewater treatment plants, and ratcheting down, and ratcheting down. And now the whole emphasis is on non-point source, the runoff in urban areas or agricultural areas. At the lower end of our refuge is North Maumee Bay and Maumee Bay, and that makes international headlines for the algal blooms right now. And so we have spent over a century in this. The Maumee River is mostly in Ohio, stretches into Michigan a little bit, and gets all the way up to Indiana. So it's like a huge watershed. We spent 100 years tiling and draining that watershed. We spent 100 years, more than 100 years, moving as much water off the land as fast as we can, just to get off the land so we can grow crops, right? Then we started winter application of fertilizer. What happens in the first flush syndrome? You know, spring comes along and it washes in. We also have a whole bunch of CAFOs, concentrated agricultural feeding operations. There's some big things that need to be regulated as point sources. We need to have an NPDES permit. So we need to ban winter application of fertilizer. We need to work with these farmers on best management practices. We need to treat these CAFOs as point sources and regulate them under the Clean Water Act through a national discharge elimination system. Working with the agricultural community is pretty hard. Working with the municipal sometimes hard. You know, it's a challenge to get them to change, but everyone is watching these issues, see how it's going to be handled, because it's not just Lake Erie. Lake Erie is once again the poster child for the world of what's wrong. But this is going on in Saginaw Bay and Green Bay and Inland Lakes and everything else. Yes?
Detroit's had a recent change in mayor, and what we've been reading lots about it. I'm sure lots of people are excited about it. I'd like to know what your relationship is like with the new mayor and what you got going on.
Absolutely. Be careful how I say it. Change is good once in a while. You know, like we have a new mayor, and very supportive of what we're doing. This whole emphasis, we created this 501c3 organization called the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. I'm on the board of it, and to reconnect people to the Detroit River, to take this 5.5 miles, create the Detroit River Walk, to program it, to connect it to the neighborhoods, and to make sure it stays in the shape we want it to stay in perpetuity. Create an endowment, $40 million endowment to operate, care, maintain, and program it in perpetuity. So the mayor is very supportive of it. The corporations, all the big corporations are supportive. You know, this has been in the works for a while, but it really got traction. The Kresge Foundation started in Detroit, in metropolitan Detroit. They gave the largest gift in the history of the foundation to kick this off. We've got the foundations have sort of catalyzed this, and then corporations came in with major gifts, governments going after grants and everything else, whether it be transportation enhancement money or Corps of Engineers money or Fish and Wildlife Service money, a whole range of that, and then getting the community to own it, you know, own a brick, buy a tree, be part of this whole thing. So it's a grand experiment that I would argue it changes every 6 months. We just opened a shipbuilding history. So they built a schooner in the land that looks like an old schooner. That's a water theme park that would marvel anything at Disney World. It's got water cannons, and you can stand up on the helm, and it's all free, you know, and it's just really cool. There are so many unique things going on. They took an old rail line, just like Rails to Trails, called the DeQuinder Cut. They kept half the rail line to not preclude future options, so they, you know, for light rail in the future, but they built a greenway connector to the oldest outdoor market in the United States called Eastern Market, which is a thriving thing. That's where all the urban agriculture is centered right now and out. And so this whole emphasis on sustainable agriculture. The Greenway Trail then goes from DeQuinder Cut to Midtown and Wayne State University. Wayne State University has 42,000 people, and Midtown is sort of the hub of activity right now, and it's a pretty exciting time. There's a question over here.
Is Detroit in all of its archives and photos and things, does it have any depictions of what the lake was like, what the Erie was like, sort of was like before the industry came?
Absolutely.
Because I feel like, you know, it's great that there's 20 people list, you know,
Yep.
and the baseline for expectations.
You can imagine when it was founded, there were no photographs, no cameras, right? So, but there are lots of art, you know, from the 1700s, and obviously we have photographs of, you know, like before there were refrigerators. How would you keep fish fresh? And they were called pond net fisheries. So the islands of the Detroit River had these big nets that were big circle ponds connected to islands, and they would catch whitefish and lake sturgeon and put them in these ponds and keep them, and twice a week would go to market in Detroit and sell them at market, you know. And so we have these archival photos from 1880 and stuff like that. We have the Underground Railroad stuff, the Prohibition stuff where we had pulley systems from Canada bringing booze on the bottom of the river and distributed by boat. So there's some pretty cool photos of all of this, and obviously I didn't have time to show all of it, but I could share some of those with you. Yes, sir.
How do you convince like private sector funding and corporations to invest in projects like this?
How do you pitch it?
Yeah, like how do you get them involved with it?
So, we started out with this, the vision for the Detroit River Walk. We wanted people to be connected to the Detroit River. We wanted clean, green, affordable, sustainable, safe. Through that whole process, it was a very meticulous, slow, multi-stakeholder process. We absolutely made sure every corporation was there. We talked to them about what is the perception of Detroit. When Ford Motor Company travels abroad, where do people think they're from? Not Dearborn, Michigan, but Detroit, Michigan. Once Dearborn's a suburb. When Chrysler Corporation is not from Auburn Hills, they're from Detroit. So no matter where you go, whatever perception of Detroit is going to follow you. So you can imagine some of the work to, like the new Mustang plant, a joint venture between Mazda and Ford to build Mustangs and to attract 20,000 people in their 20s. What would it take to get a 20-year-old to come to Detroit? We talked to them about that. We said, we can help you sell Detroit, but you're going to have to work with us. So we've got them involved every step of the way. When we did the multi-stakeholder vision for the International Wildlife Refuge, when the Greenway Trail System, the same thing. I think corporations were way ahead of us in thinking because of sustainable development. When our common future came out in the mid-'80s, corporations bought into that big, and governments and NGOs were a little lagging in it. And then but we could come together on this sustainability vision pretty quickly, and that helped a lot. And so, and then making a pitch to the foundations, taking them out on boats, taking them on hikes and on islands, and seeing what could be possible for Detroit. You have a question?
It was very much related to that about stakeholders and particularly well-founded industry stakeholders in Detroit and how they accept their liability for the current condition of the river and participate in their development.
That was my unexpected line,
Yeah.
Like liability, you are always going to be surprised, and it gets very sticky when you come in and you're going to reclaim a piece of land, and it's not been cleaned up to human health and wildlife standards. So you're going to have pieces of Riverwalk, you have to go behind closed door, and there has to be the threat of litigation, and then the carrot to do the right thing. And help move the process. I think what you can do through that is, litigation can be decades, 10 and 20 years, because a settlement could be $50 million or $100 million on something. But if you can speed that up a lot, going through it and making them part of a bigger thing, a bigger vision. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What was the litigation that was threatened?
If anyone knows Detroit Waterfront, we had a former Uniroyal tire plant, and it's where the bridge goes over to Belle Isle, our island jewel, a 982-acre island in the Detroit River, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, same person who did Central Park. So it's a mile of waterfront that's contaminated, and some of the corporations are gone, so there is no PRP, potentially responsible party. And so of the ones that are left, how do we engage them and how do we move through it? There is no easy way to go through the eye of the needle. You have to go through it. But these other successes, these small successes over here, and then reminding them of the big vision. You know what I mean? Reminding them of the big vision was really important, you know, and I think we've, you know, just in the most difficult economy in the largest city to go through bankruptcy in the United States, we've raised $140 million just for this alone. It's pretty good, you know. And of course, they had to save the Art Institute, which is one of the top 10 art institutes, and they had to save a few other things along the way with funding too, you know. So, yes, sir.
Could you speak a little bit about the First Nations involvement in this project?
Yeah. We wouldn't be walking the talk if they weren't at the table. So we have the Wyandotte of Androdot Nation. These the same tribe, the Wyandottes that went to Oklahoma and the Trail of Tears. They started in the area, and so they are woven through with us. They were one of the many voices that helped save Humbug Marsh, this last mile of natural shoreline on the river. We have worked with them on different projects like sacred land ceremonies to bless the cleanup and involve students in it. We've helped them acquire Native American burial ground, an ossuary, as on a greenway trail, and give them a chance to interpret their culture in the context of what we're doing. So they've been with us since the beginning. We had to do that. You know, I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's U.S. Department of Interior. Anyone who knows the sensitivity of U.S. Department of Interior and First Nations and Native Americans, you know, but we have a great relationship. They work with us very closely, and it's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.